We've seen how to use a grid in a panel object. We'll now see the considerations we need to have when adding more than one grid to the panel. This will give us the knowledge necessary to continue the development of our travel agency application. We'll build a panel object that shows the attractions and cities of a country received by parameter. For that, we make a save as of the View Attractions More Info panel, and we name it View Attractions Country Info. Then we remove its main object setting, because the goal is to have it called from the grid of attractions when the country's name is clicked on. In the form, we're going to remove the titles we had, since we'll show titles by section, and in the grid, we're going to add a detail variable of character type. This variable will be used later to invoke a panel that shows the details of each attraction. In the events, we delete the lines that assign the text to the titles. And to the detail variable, we assign the caption details. In the form, we add the country name attribute and delete the country ID variable of dynamic combo type, since we'll not choose a country, but receive it by parameter. We remove the variable from the conditions. We delete the control value changed event associated with the variable we removed, and the where clause that used it. In the parm rule, we change the country ID variable to the country ID attribute. To group all the data of the attractions and then the data of the cities, we insert a table control from the toolbar. And we place the variables attraction name from, attraction name to, the grid, and the variable total trips inside the table. To the right, we insert another table as a separator, and then we insert a grid to show the cities of the country with the attributes city ID and city name. We add titles to the sections, placing a text block, attractions, above the attractions section, and cities above the cities section. We change the class to text block title. To define how we want the contents of a table to be shown, we must change the size of the table rows or columns. For example, we want the grids to have enough space in the corresponding row to be displayed correctly, and to assign more space to the column of the table that shows the content of the attractions, because we have more things to show than for the cities. For that, we have the column style and rows style properties of the table. First, we'll change the columns that we know are 3, the column containing the attractions data, the column with the separating table, and the column containing the city's data. If we select Table 1 and click on the column style property, by default, each column takes up 33% of the available space. The possible values to be assigned to the column's width are a percentage of the total table space, or in device independent pixels, DIPS. This measure allows assigning units that are an abstraction of a pixel, don't depend on the platform, and will later be converted to real pixels when the application is executed. The number of pixels that each dip will take up depends on the dimensions of the screen. This allows us to scale to different screen sizes using standard sizes. Let's assign 50% of the available space to the first column, 25% to the second column, and 25% to the third column. This space is what remains after having assigned the columns with dips. That is, the percentages are relative to the value that results from subtracting the fixed values, in dips, from the total width. Now, we change the height of the rows. We click on the rows style property and see that by default, We can assign the values using percentages, dips, and platform default. This last value varies between platforms, and for the same platform, it also depends on the cell's content. We're going to assign that value to all the rows except row 4, where the grids are, which we set to occupy the 100% that remains available. If we right-click to see the navigation of the object we built, the output window shows an error. If we look at the error in the navigation list, it says that the load event cannot be programmed if we have multiple grids. If we go to the events, we see that we still have the load event programmed as we had it in the original object. Here we don't consider what we said before about the convenience of using the load event of the grid and not the generic one to avoid that situation. So, we add grid 1 to the load. If we select View Navigation, we see that the problem has been solved. Before running, we go to the View Attractions More Info panel and add the Country ID attribute, which is required to go to the information panel of a country when we click on the name of the country in the grid. Next, in the country name attribute, we add a tap event where we write the invocation to the View Attractions Country Info panel, passing it the country ID as parameter. We run it to see all this. If we click on France, the information of the country France is opened, showing the attractions with the total number of trips of each attraction and the total number of trips to France. To the right are the cities of that country. If we go to the navigation list, we see that now there's a level detail entry for grid 1 and another one for grid 2. For grid 1, we see the access to the attraction table and the navigation of the formula that we saw when we implemented the panel View Attractions More Info. If we select the node corresponding to grid 2, we see that the grid is accessing the city table to show the cities, filtering by country ID, the attribute received in the parm rule. In a similar way to the totals shown for the attractions and the filter by name, we'll show the number of attractions of each city and in the country, and we'll add a filter by city name. In the Variables tab, we create an attractions variable, another one called Total Attractions, and a third one called City Name. Now we add the attractions variable to the grid by setting its label position property to none. Then we add total attractions below the grid and the filter variable city name above the city grid. In the grid, we add the necessary condition for the filter. Before that, we take the opportunity to assign the base transaction property in city. Here we click on Conditions and write the filter condition using the like operator, since we'll not filter by name range, but by a similar name. Then, we add the event grid2.load, where we load the attractions variable with a count formula, with the attraction name attribute. Since the base table of the grid is city, the formula will only count the attractions of the city corresponding to each line. To calculate the total number of attractions, for the same reasons as when we calculated the total number of trips, we write the event grid2.refresh, in which we programmed a for each command on the attractions table to count the attractions, which will be filtered by the attribute of the country identifier received by parameter. If we now see the panel navigation list, in the node Level Detail Grid 2, we see the navigation of the ForEach command to the attraction table, and below it, the navigation of the count formula on the attraction table. And here we see the filter we added by city name. Let's run our main object, View Attractions More Info, to see what we did. We click on France again, and now we can see the total number of attractions of each city in France, and the total number of attractions of the country France. We saw that because we had more than one grid in the panel, we had to use the refresh and load event of each grid. But after adding these events, we wonder what the triggering order of these events will be in relation to the events of the panel object. When the panel object is executed for the first time, the events will be triggered in the following order. First, the start event, only once. Then, the generic refresh event, that is, the panel's own refresh event. And finally, the refresh of the first grid. If it has a base table, the load event of the grid will be executed as many times as records are retrieved from the database, filtering the corresponding records. If it doesn't have a base table, the load event of the grid is executed only once. And if it is a grid based on an SDT, the load event is not executed. And then the same with the refresh and load events of the second grid. Since there's more than one grid, the refresh command must also be specialized to indicate which grid you want to refresh. The generic refresh command, the one we had seen when we used it in the View Attractions More Info panel, causes the generic refresh to be executed, as well as the refresh and load event of each grid, that is, everything but start. And now, we also have the refresh method of a grid, which will refresh only the grid. That is to say, run the grid refresh and load, n times, once, or never, depending on whether the grid has a base table, or if it's a grid of a collection SDT variable respectively. In this video, we saw how we can work with multiple grids in a panel object, in this case, with parallel grids, and the considerations we need to have when invoking the events of each grid.